Let's talk about sex, baby. All right, that's a shout out to my Gen X generation. Anybody knows, where that came from, you drop it in the comments. But like today, we are talking about sex. And specifically, we're talking about whether withholding sex or a lack of sex, is that emotional abuse, or is it just having a boundary? Or maybe it could be both. So I want to get into it first by just sort of prefacing that the reason I'm talking about this topic is I had done another video about domestic violence. And one of the things that came up in domestic violence, so we were talking about abuse and emotional abuse. And there was actually a number of men who brought up that the withholding of sex is a form of emotional abuse. And I think that absolutely can be true. I was not able to find statistics on like how often this ends up being the case, like where a partner, usually a woman, I think that's fair to say that, ends up withholding sex in a relationship for a reason. And it's viewed oftentimes by a man as coercive control. And I think that absolutely can be the case. And in fact, I had a friend whose husband wouldn't have sex with her. And we were in our 30s, and it was devastating. And that's never been, not to tell tales, but that's just not really ever been an issue in my marital relationship. And in fact, I was talking with Jake, my producer, and he was kind of like, this is such a foreign concept to me. He's a newlywed, and so they're just all over it. It's kind of like, I'm like, guys, come on, I'm here, get a room, they're just in love. Like most newlyweds just love each other and love being together. But that, as most people, especially if you've been married any amount of time. And sometimes it does happen earlier in marriages, especially if children come along. But over time, that tends to wax and wane. It is not true for everybody. I'm not saying if you want to tell me how many times you have sex with your spouse because whatever in the comments, you can. Quite frankly, I'm going to just put it out there. I get it that this is not going to be everybody, but I am going to say it's the majority of people are not spending their days and nights 3-4 times a day having sex. So in fact, one of the things that's always been really kind of funny to me is like how people like make their sexual identity such a big daggum deal. Because I tried to do the math on it one time. And I mean, I don't know, maybe I spend, or most people spend, I would say 2% of my entire life engaged in sex, but we sure are preoccupied by it. And I think it's for reasons. I think it's God-given reasons. Be fruitful and multiply. So of course we got sex on the brain. We sing about it. We talk about it. We think, we complain about how much we're getting or not getting, or how much people want, it's prolific. But I think there's a lot of reasons why we have this going on. And I'm going to speak specifically to my frame of reference, which is growing up, medical high school in the 80s and whatnot. Even I'll say it's like, we're going to have some, name that tune today, like pour some sugar on me, or my blood runs cold. My memory has just been sold. Da, na, 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 na. Angel in the centerfold. All this was wrapped up in this idea of women as sexual objects. Like we had moved out of where women were in the home and they were like the madmen wives who were perfectly coiffed, and all of their value came in how they could entertain the boss with the Clark's beefsteaks when they came over, and the perfect hair, the perfect home. And in the 60s, the sexual revolution and birth control and women getting out there. And so like, how do we now find our place? How do women now relate to one another? And women took sexual sovereignty over themselves. And as part of that, they kind of adopted some of the at least stereotypical worst male proclivities, which is spreading it around like a sprinkler. You know what I mean? What used to be like something that would get a person cast out of society, now like there's songs. I don't even listen to all the songs on the radio. I'm not going to try to lie, but my daughter listens to some stuff where I'm kind of like, did she just say what I think she said? But it's like basically put it all out there, back it up. We've mistaken being promiscuous, having multi partners, I think it's called body counts, mistaken having a high body count with somehow being desirable, valuable, or maybe that only applies to men or women, or it depends on how old you are, if that's okay or if it's not okay. And the truth of the matter is that every time that we merge physically with a person, there is an energetic connection there. There is a spiritual connection there. Not to get too graphic, but many, many times there's a DNA deposit there. It is a big deal. Getting back more to the topic of what we're talking about, like in marriage, this withholding or having sex, being open to one another in sex or whatnot, becomes a much more complex issue because men are viewing women as sexual objects, but also the keeper of sex. Like the gatekeeper, so to speak, especially in marriage. I've heard men like say it that way. She won't give it to me. She won't give it up. Where women feel like on the one hand, we're supposed to really feel comfortable with ourselves and be willing to display our assets. And if you grew up when I did, that's like putting all your assets out there on display, so to speak. And also, by the way, men are supposed to look at us up here, not here, up here, even though we're putting all this out up here, because it's not our responsibility to control them. And so there's all these crazy, legit mixed messages around sex. Here's what sex is actually meant to be: an extraordinarily unique, intimate exchange, emotional exchange, physical exchange, spiritual exchange, heart exchange. And I'm going to say this, between a husband and wife. Not like, hey, go try it out. It's not meant to be a party favor. It's not meant to be a recreational activity outside of marriage, because it has become kind of common. Like, it's been diluted, and it's become that way in society. It's become emotionally charged, and that's to get us away from having that genuine, unique, loving connection that is meant to be between you and your very best friend, who is meant to be your spouse, you and your life partner, who is meant to be your spouse, you and the person that I wouldn't say we're not whole people. So when I say complete, like we are those two sides that God said he will make man in his likeness and image. He will make man, humans, female and male. It is not good for them to be alone. So he gave Adam, Eve, and Eve became Adam's wife, and that is where the sexual union is meant to stay. And I'm not saying this from a legalistic standpoint. I'm saying this from a, I've got a vehicle that says use premium gas standpoint, so I don't go and put in regular. I mean, will it run on it? Sure. But after a period of time, it's not going to have near the performance. And I guarantee if I go and I throw diesel in there, it's going to break down. It's just not good stuff. Speaking of diesel, I will tell you what sex diesel is. Pornography. It is terrible. It is toxic. It's similar, like, I'm not throwing shade on people who drink. I'm not saying this is not a Christian commentary on drinking or not drinking, right? But alcohol is poison that we put into our body to give us a high. It actually is meant to interfere with our present emotional state. It's a depressant. It's meant to make us disconnect so that we can feel better. Just disengage, like they tell addicts when they go in, hey, look, you're going to have to give up your drug of choice. And they were like, well, crap, this is going to be painful. Why? Because they don't have that anesthesia. So likening this to alcohol, porn is like alcohol. It disconnects us. So we get this false disconnection from a toxin. Porn's the same way. We look at pornography, and I say men generally, not saying no women do, but men generally will go for more visual, go on the internet and look at videos, and they get that visual stimulation, and then it all is going on in their heads, but not to exempt women. I heard about this the other day, and it was, I think, on Diary of a CEO, where there was a dopamine specialist who was talking about addictions, and she was saying how not necessarily porn, but addictions in general just flood our body with dopamine, and it makes it to where, we're essentially miserable. We flood ourselves with dopamine through our addictions, and then the brain has to balance that out. But here was the interesting part. She said that she became addicted to these very torrid romance novels. And in fact, the very first time I ever heard in my life anything about a bodice ripper, she, started reading these very explicit sexual novels that didn't have pictures. The same thing is going on in her head, that she's going into this escapism. And when it comes to the sexual relationship, if you've got a man who's looking at an airbrushed version of a woman who's smiling, or, oh wait, and I'm not seen a lot of porn, but I saw maybe some old bad porn where basically girl walks in, oh my gosh, look at you. Oh, oh, I want to have sex with you because you're you do nothing, you say nothing. Guy sitting there at a desk, usually with a giant porn mustache, dirty boots up on the desk, not doing anything. I'm going to tell you, I have never, ever, and granted, I may have a small social circle, but I've never, ever, 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 ever known a woman who sees a guy looking like that and wants to get up on it. It just doesn't happen, guys. It's not real. And so when you feed yourself this toxin, neurotoxin, really, you feed yourself this and then, these images, and you've got that image on demand. She looks like you want. She'll do what you want. She'll say what you want. And then you're face to face with, the reality of a real live person who has emotions and has their own wants and desire. No, and guess what? Needs something to get there. Needs something more than just, like I said, looking at you with your porn stash to be in the mood. And then women who either from hearing stories, on TV, even just the rom-coms, whatever, they think, it's like, oh, I'm so tired. A man's got to hear me, see me, understand me, basically be me in order for me, to get into a place where they're not feeling used. And I think that's where the boundary issue comes in. So like women often will get to a point where they're like, listen, I am not just a place to pump and dump. I literally had a guy in the comments, and I'm going to just say this. He said this about his wife, that he dumps. And I'm like, what? Instant. I wish I had her number because, you're not as a lawyer supposed to be able to solicitate like business, but come on already. Women are not receptacles, okay? That's not what women are meant for. They're not, I'm not going to get any more graphic than that. All I could say some things. It's just disrespectful. I, as a leader, have had to learn that respect is something that is earned, and a man wants to be respected in his home, cannot behave disrespectfully, especially in this core area of intimacy. If you want to encourage a person to respect you, encourage a person to want to be with you, you can't treat them like a thing or a tool or just something that's there for your use and toss away, if that makes sense. Drawing this kind of like full circle about, is it emotional abuse? Is it withholding? I would say in most cases, the withholding is probably a symptom of emotional disconnection. And I would also say that to someone who is hearing from a spouse, I don't get enough sex. What they're actually saying is, I don't have enough connection with you. Now, obviously, the corollary to that would be they're not dealing with something like a porn addiction. If someone's in a porn addiction, honestly, it's like anything else. You're not going to be able to satisfy that. That's something that has to absolutely be dealt with because sex is not even the thing. It's the emotional issue that's coming on that's attached to that. But when sex is utilized as a weapon, one way or another, if it's used as a weapon or a tool to soothe how you feel about yourself, or you are keeping it away from your spouse as a form of sovereignty or control, you can really get into some dangerous territory. In fact, for any of you who are believers, take a look at the Song of Solomon. There was a time when in that poem, the king came to the door and knocked. And basically, he was inviting his beloved into sexual union. And she didn't answer his call. And she was thrown out into the street in the story after that as being wicked. That's because that is a place where we really are to work to. And that doesn't mean manufacture, but to work to be available to one another. That's as close as we can be physically to another person. And like I said, there is a unique spiritual, emotional bonding that takes place when we're that close to one another. So if you find yourself or your spouse like over here and you're over here, if your spouse is coming towards you for sex, you should read that as a signal that they want to be closer with you, absent the abuse of pornography or sex abuse in some way. And if your spouse is, you're coming toward and they're moving away, again, there's something going on here that's probably emotional, maybe medical. Again, women go through hormonal changes throughout life, early puberty, even into their 20s, and then pregnancy, and then later, even starting as mid-30s, perimenopause and menopause. So it could be hormonal, or there could be trauma going on there. So we are called in marriage to be, we say it in our vows, right? right? In sickness and in health. And if you're not well in the arena of sex, work to mend that rift, work to come together in that rather than blaming the other person as being oversexed or not sexed enough and using it as your excuse to write them off.